Welcome to DC Insiders, where we bring you sharp views about global issues with relevance to Taiwan from the political capital of the world here in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Wenchi Yu. Today, our guest is Matt Goodman of the Council on Foreign Relations and formerly with the White House National Security Council and State Department. Welcome, Matt.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
So we have to talk about tariffs. I'm going to cite what the president said in terms of his goals. His goals are to correct global imbalances, to revitalize manufacturing, to secure supply chains, and to confront non-market economies, and to reduce dependence on foreign adversaries in the defense industrial base. If you could just explain it in a more layman's way to us, what is his vision of this American economy that he's trying to create?
Well, first of all, can I admit that I don't know? He has said many things about these issues, and that's a long list. I would add to that raising revenues he's talked about before, which tariffs, can do. So this is a problem, is that we don't really know what his vision is or what he really wants.
Is it about restoring factory jobs?
Look, I think that's part of it. I think the president has a long-standing beef about two things, really. One is that we have these huge trade imbalances with major countries, China, of course, but also with many of our close allies and partners. And that's one thing for 30 plus years he's been focused on and concerned about. And the other is he feels a sense that somehow the U.S. has lost its strength, its economic ability to produce things, and so I do think part of this is about bringing manufacturing jobs back.
And why is manufacturing good for America?
Well, I think every country needs to make things. I think some level of manufacturing is important. It's still about 10% of the U.S. economy, although we have become largely a services economy, but there's still manufacturing out there. I think for both national security reasons and also for innovation reasons. I think for the Taiwan audience, there's quite an understanding that when you make things, you actually learn things as you're producing things. And I think that's an important element of this. So I understand on that level why the president thinks that's important. The problem is, can we really build a significant manufacturing capability as we had in the past, and will that bring a lot of jobs?
Yeah, I think that's what's confusing to the world, which is he keeps saying he wants to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States, but do Americans really want to work in factories, for example, right? And why isn't just service jobs good enough? America is actually extremely good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's some very high-end services jobs. I hate to say it, but
yeah.
Working for television or working at a think tank, I think is a pretty advanced set of services. And you're right that manufacturing is not for everybody. And I think most people, when they're asked about that, say, yes, we should have manufacturing, but I don't personally want to work in a factory. So I do think that's one of the questions about all this, as to whether we're going to get enough workers with the skills needed to be able to do what we need to make things. But again, some manufacturing does feel like something the United States needs to be able to do, and I certainly think for national security reasons we have to be able to produce some things that are important for that.
Since you mentioned national security, I have to ask, do you think overall is China the ultimate target of this policy change?
I think China is a very important part of this, but I'd actually start with the trade imbalance before I started with national security, because again, Donald Trump has been obsessed with trade deficits for a long time, and I think that's probably his primary concern with China. Others around him are worried about other things, national security related things, but I think for him it's really about these trade imbalances. And so yes, because it's the biggest trade imbalance we have, I do think it's central to what he's trying to do.
Yes. So you're essentially saying rather than treating China as many, perhaps China hawks might think of China, he cares more about trade imbalances, and it just so happens that China has the largest trade imbalance.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an important point generally about Donald Trump and his administration. I mean, a president is always very important, and his views on policy, his personality is always very important. But in this, I think it's particularly true, or it's almost unique, really, with Donald Trump, that there's his view, and then there's everyone else around him who have somewhat different views maybe on some of this. And as you say, I think many people around him are more focused on national security concerns and about other concerns about China. For him, I think it's largely about this trade problem.
美方想要通过谈判解决问题，就要正视单边关税措施给自身和世界带来的严重负面影响，正视国际经贸规则、公平正义和各界理性声音，拿出谈的诚意，要在纠正错误做法、取消单边加征关税等问题上做好准备，拿出行动。如果说一套做一套，甚至企图以谈为幌子，继续搞胁迫、讹诈，中方绝不会答应，更不会牺牲原则立场，牺牲国际公平正义去寻求达成任何协议。
I'm very friendly with President Xi. I have great respect for him and for China, but we can't continue to allow them to do what they did. When I was president, they paid hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs and taxes. And then Biden screwed it all up. What he did to this country between the border and between all of the other problems, the wars, everything, what he did to this country should never be forgotten. But one of the things he did is the trade was so bad and so imbalanced. So I think we're going to come back with a fair deal for both China and us.
We still need to have some trade with China. And then the big question becomes, what's the nature of that deal? What are we actually going to talk about? And that's really difficult to see. What could Xi Jinping offer Donald Trump that would be credible? There was a deal in his first term, in Trump's first term, to buy a lot of things from the United States, and that deal wasn't honored. And even if it was, it probably wouldn't have fundamentally changed the trade imbalance. And so, I think that's a big question, is what China can offer the United States. And then an even bigger question is what the United States can offer China. Really, there are two things that Xi Jinping, I think, wants more than anything from the United States. And unfortunately, one of them is for the U.S. to back off, at least on Taiwan, if not give Taiwan to China. And then the other is sort of more access to our technology by reducing export controls or relaxing export controls. Neither of those things is something Donald Trump is going to be able to do lightly.
So again, this agreement is really about the reciprocal tariff, which was imposed by the United States on April 2nd, and the escalatory steps which followed. Those on each side, the Chinese side and the U.S. side, ended up at 125% on each other. The Chinese had additional non-tariff countermeasures. That has all come down by 115% to 10% each. The United States earlier this year imposed 20% related to fentanyl. That still exists. So if you're looking at Trump term 2, tariffs on China, right now effective, it's 30%. There are prior measures which change by product, by sector, by level, etc. You can't really give a specific number on that right now. What matters for the agreement today is that we each agreed to come down on the reciprocal tariff and related retaliation to 10%. So a reduction of 115% down to 10%. Fentanyl is on its own track, but on a very positive track where we're having very constructive conversations with our Chinese counterparts.
Well, you've been in DC for a long time, especially, around in sort of the economic policy realm. Who is really in charge in this administration when it comes to trade with China?
Donald Trump. I mean, I think it's that easy. It's clearly Trump's lead. He's obviously being closely advised by Peter Navarro, first of all, in the White House, who has a very strong view on these trade issues with China and wants to really, I think frankly, he wants to decouple our relationship, even if that's not fully realistic. And so I think he's quite influential. You have the senior cabinet members that people are talking about, Treasury Secretary Bessent, Commerce Secretary Lutnick, I think are important. But in the end, I think Donald Trump keeps his own counsel on trade issues.
What about USTR?
Yeah, Jamison Greer is obviously important. The USTR will have to negotiate these deals. But, frankly, I think he's outgunned right now by some of the other senior people in the administration.
He's relatively junior.
He's relatively junior and hasn't been in this principal position. He's been a staff person and a good lawyer, a good guy, a serious guy, but I'm not sure that he has the same political throw weight that some of the others around Trump have.
We know that a lot of mainstream economists and mainstream media have been very critical of Trump's economic and trade policy, but some do defend him. If Trump's approach is going to be successful, What do you think the success would look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that there are a lot of people who think that we need to take on some of these unfair trade practices, that we need to try to get more, production in the United States. Some of the things that have been laid out as objectives here, I think there's agreement on it. The problem comes with the tactics of doing these broad-based and very heavy tariffs that aren't really linked directly to those issues about unfair trade practices and so forth. I think it's going to be case by case. There are now 70 countries or something in the queue to do negotiations over this 90-day pause period. We'll see whether deals can be struck with any of them, frankly. Maybe a few. Taiwan may be one of the candidates if possible in this period. But my former colleague Wendy Cutler just wrote a piece in which she was saying, look, trade negotiations take a long time. I mean, this is very accelerated. 90 days seems like an eternity in the Trump administration, but it's a very short time in trade negotiations. So I'm not sure deals can be struck with most countries in that period. But
Then what will happen?
I think you'll probably see a few deals. And the question is, how high a bar is there going to be for countries to be able to get at least some sort of handshake that puts off the tariffs for some period? For most countries, I think there's going to have to be some sort of extension. I mean, the countries that are actively negotiating, it's not going to be done in 90 days for many of them. And other countries who won't even get a hearing in that period, smaller countries, I think they're going to have to push pause further on those. But I think if Trump, from his point of view, can show that he's reached 2 or 3 meaningful deals, maybe with some of the East Asian countries, he'll be able to then say, look, we're having good conversations with the others, and so we're going to extend this period further.
I want to thank Prime Minister Starmer and his very talented team for their outstanding work and partnership. Today's agreement with the UK is the first in a series of agreements on trade that my administration has been negotiating over the past 4 weeks. With this deal, the UK joins the United States in affirming that reciprocity and fairness is an essential and vital principle of international trade.
So this sounds like, from what you just said, it's less actually about reaching deals with every single country, but more having something to show to perhaps his constituents that he's been able to accomplish something.
I mean, I don't want to be too cynical, but I think with Donald Trump, a lot of this is a show. He wants to demonstrate that he's strong and he's in charge and he's getting others to, make concessions to him. And it's more about that in a way than it is about the contents of the deals that he makes. And so I think that feels like a path forward as you try and push hard on a few key countries, get some sort of deal, maybe not even the final deal, but something that he can declare some interim victory on, and then postpone deals or extend the pause with other countries to try and reach other deals.
I think that's actually a really important point for people to actually know that perhaps, reaching a deal is not the ultimate goal. So you just talked about how tariffs alone cannot really address unfair trade issues. For a normal situation, right, what would be the other policy measures put in place in order to really address this unfair trade issue?
Well, I think at the end of the day, I'm an economist who started at the Treasury Department. I learned early on that really what this is about is macro imbalances. We consume a lot, we don't save enough, and then sort of by definition, that means we're going to have trade deficits. And so I think until we can get better balance in our own domestic consumption and savings, if to use fancy terms, but essentially to consume a little bit less, save a little bit more. And by converse, other countries, particularly big ones like China, Germany, other big trading partners that have historically underconsumed. They haven't consumed as much as where they save a lot, and that again by definition means they tend to have they have to have sort of trade surpluses, so they need more balance. If you get that balance across these countries, and that's a function of domestic policies, macroeconomic policies like investment in things that make people consume more or disincentivize savings in some way. If you have the converse policies in the countries with surpluses and deficits, and that establishes more balance, that would actually make a difference over time. But I don't think these micro trade deals no matter how big they are, is really going to solve the fundamental problem that Trump is worried about.
Now let's take a quick break. You're watching DC Insiders on TaiwanPlus. We'll be back in a moment.
The Taipei Tonight Show wins Best Talk Show at the 2024 Asian Television Awards.
Thank you.
Thanks for your support. Stay tuned for more award-winning stories from Taiwan on TaiwanPlus.
Welcome back to DC Insiders. We're talking today to Matt Goodman of the Council on Foreign Relations on Trump 2.0's economic and trade policy. You also mentioned on his sort of top list, the majority of them are actually East Asian countries, including many of the U.S. allies, like Japan, right? Like Taiwan, etc. How have they reacted to Trump's high tariffs? Let's just use Japan as an example.
Yeah, well, Japan is the country in the region that I know the best, and I would say, you know, they were a little shocked to find themselves on this.
So no one was prepared.
Well, I think they were prepared in a broad sense. They knew that this was the trade was a high priority for Trump, and that he had threatened to put tariffs on broad basis on many countries. But I think when they were told that they were going to be subject to reciprocal tariffs of 24% in their case, which wasn't really based on any real science other than the pure simplistic, you know, trade imbalance problem, and that they were going to be subject to a 10% global tariff, and maybe most importantly, that they're going to pay 25% for autos. The auto industry is really the heart and soul of the Japanese economy and a significant part of their trade.
To the
They
US.
export still a lot of cars from Japan. They do produce a lot of cars in North America, but not all in the United States. Some, you know, with parts from Canada and Mexico as part of the USMCA, the North American trade arrangement. But they still sell a lot of cars from Japan into the United States. And so for them, this is existential. I think that's probably their single priority, is to try and get that auto tariff reduced or removed, or at least postponed.
Is that possible?
I think it's possible as part of a bigger deal with Japan, but it's hard because autos is at the heart of Trump's concerns about trade and about ungrateful allies, because he sees, you know, these countries selling lots of cars, and in the United States for 30 years he's been worried about that. So I think it's going to be hard, but I think it's going to be what Japan's going to be most interested in getting as on their side of a deal with Trump. And so, you know, I think all East Asian countries are in some ways combination of shocked, maybe not surprised, and working hard to try to find some middle ground or some basis for a deal.
I thought that's interesting that Japan's selling U.S. bonds seems to have triggered some anxiety or even panic in the U.S. market.
Well, this is a serious issue. I mean, obviously, it's a problem already. The stock market's been falling, that inflation may be going up, that our economy may be slowing. But the bond market holds a special place because it's the basis for paying for our big deficits and debt. It is a signal of where interest rates are going to go, which affect loans and businesses and mortgages. And so it's a really important market. And more broadly, it's a symbol of our strength in a way, our bond market and our ability to attract confidence in the U.S.
Right.
And so I think the fact that the Treasury market was softening or sinking, and therefore interest rates were going up on Treasuries, was a real source of concern. And, you know, it's no accident that it was after a day or two of that the president kind of reversed himself on the Liberation Day reciprocal tariffs. So yeah, that's a big concern.
Well, especially from, you know, a close ally like Japan. And of course, you know, U.S. and China are still at the center of this trade tariffs, or you can say renewed trade war. And a lot of people say China actually has more cars than the U.S. this time. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that China has a lot of leverage. First of all, they're big, and that makes them powerful. A lot of countries depend on their market now to sell, including we depend on their market. Many other trading partners of ours, you know, China's their biggest market, not us anymore for some people. And then, of course, they're a source of a lot of imports and inputs into what we buy and what we put into the things we buy. So obviously critical minerals, for example, is something they have, near monopoly power on a lot of the production of critical minerals that go into, electronics or into military systems. And so they can use that leverage to try to squeeze us if we push them too hard, and they've done that, or at least threatened to do that.
Right.
And so that is a source of leverage for them. On the other hand, China depends on us a lot as well for technologies, for product inputs, for production capabilities, and other things, and as a market, obviously, because almost everything we're looking at, had some China nexus, and we're a big consumer of their products, and their economy has been slowing. So I think for a lot of reasons, they're not in the strongest position in these negotiations either.
But it seems like they are prepared to endure some kind of pain.
Yeah, I mean, that's, China has spent thousands of years enduring worse things than this. And so I think I wouldn't bet against them in terms of an ability to endure. But, modern China is going to suffer a new kind of pain and political problems if Xi Jinping allows the economy to slow further, or for this relationship with the United States to be dysfunctional. That's not going to help him politically at home. There are pressures on him as well.
Let's talk about the U.S., right? Because the U.S. essentially has weaponized the world economy. What do you think are the strongest key levers, the U.S. economic power, and what are the essential vulnerabilities?
Well, obviously, we're the biggest economy in the world, and so that gives us a lot of power and leverage. If you want to sell into the United States, our big consumer market, you got to be nice to us on some level. Secondly, there's the dollar. The dollar is still the center of the international financial system, and majority of foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. We have the most deep, liquid, open capital markets in the world. So if you want to invest somewhere money, you want it to be in dollars and in the U.S. market. That gives us a lot of leverage, which we've used, as you said, to weaponize economic interdependence, through sanctions and export controls and other things that people, it makes it harder for them to earn the dollars or get the dollars they need. And then we have just broader influence because we created a lot of the institutions and the rules of the international system. And, we have a lot of influence over those things.
And what are the vulnerabilities?
Well, obviously, we're vulnerable because we depend so much on other countries for inputs and imports. At the moment, we have sort of specific vulnerabilities of a risk to growth and to inflation and our huge debt. That is probably the biggest single thing that one should be worried about, because we have trillions and trillions of dollars of debt that we're going to have to finance. I'm not predicting, and certainly don't want to cause a scare by saying that there's the ability to finance that is at risk. We have a great ability, because we can issue debt in our own currency to finance that. But at some point, especially if outside investors lose confidence in us as a sort of safe haven to invest in, I think that could be at risk. And so that's the biggest probably vulnerability. It's not something that is one that other countries can exploit easily, because if we went down, they would go down too.
But isn't China the biggest debt holder?
Well, Japan, I think, still is, but China's right up there. They're both very big holders.
And China hasn't really weaponized.
Yeah, I mean, it's this old story that if I owe the bank $100, then I have a problem. But if I owe the bank $1 million, the bank has a problem. Mm-hmm. And China is lending us $1 million. I mean, they're lending us a lot of money. If they pull back too fast and we sort of collapse in some way, it'll hurt them, as much or more than it hurts us. So I think that leverage is theoretical, but it's going to be hard for them to exploit. But they have been diversifying their holdings and reducing their holdings, or they're at least slowing their purchases of our treasuries over time, and that should be a source of concern by the way, from China and Japan and other bondholders here.
We all think that with those tariffs in place, smaller economies will be affected the most, obviously. And for someone like Taiwan, what is your advice for their longer term economic strategy?
Well, I wouldn't deign to advise Taiwan on anything, but it's obviously an important, you may say small, but it's a significant economy, and obviously it's particularly significant in producing semiconductors and other things that the rest of the world needs. I think we all have a huge stake in Taiwan continuing to succeed as a strong, healthy economy. It's also now, as you know, your companies are investing in the United States, and that's an important source of growth, and I think connection between us and Taiwan that I think is important for both of us.
So rather than diversifying Taiwan's investment in other parts of the world, you think Taiwan should double down?
Well, I think they should do both. I mean, I think we're all trying to hedge in a way. We all need to find different markets to purchase from, to sell into, to produce in. And I would imagine that Taiwan is going to have to be looking not just at investing here in the United States, but in other countries as well. There are obviously security-related concerns, but I would say just for having supply chains and options economically that don't make you so dependent on one place. So I would imagine that's the direction Taiwan's going to go, but I wouldn't deign to give advice to Taiwan.
Well, you're too humble. I think Taiwan is looking to have a lot of expert advice at this moment, actually. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us.
Delighted to be here. Thanks, Wenchi.
Thank you for watching DC Insiders. Please follow us on social media to get the latest episode. See you next time.